reintroduce my book, it's not going to waste time. But I would like to take a moment to have a moment of silence for a just peace in Palestine and Israel. So I thought we could honor, pay tribute to the horror that's going on there by a moment of silence. So today we are culminating our the fourth and last lecture seminar. I think we're going to get Michael exercising today, but finds it hard to sit. So it's going to, I think, for even if you haven't been to all of them, I just think it's better warning, but if you've been to all of them, this is still that. And as always, we're going to go through his presentation, then we'll open it up for discussion and conversation. So I will not introduce him. I do want to just remind everybody that this whole series has been a joint adventure between sociology and the andStuart studies project. And they have the funding for my whole teaching, so I just want to acknowledge the institutional support, but also thanks to everybody. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Well, let me reiterate what very grateful for the invitation. And thank you, and thanks for these and my discussion. That's 8 hours trying to our things to respond to some of the issues that we have raised. And talking about us, I think it's amazing though it may seem, what I'm going to say today has probably relevance, might have relevance in as we try to think about the voices which is embedded in this enormous book, Black Reconstruction, which will be the center of the analysis today. I think this book is and I will also be talking about phenomenology and we will build the section and the structure. Today's talk is rather ambitious, so I'm going to stand up absolutely that way. So what I want to actually an overview of what I intend to do today to make sure everybody makes sense of where time I'm not getting to where. Okay, good. All right. I'll stand up. Okie dokie. You see this gentleman, these two gentlemen. See that guy on the right is W.B. Du Bois, having a good time sharing each other with Chairman Mao in 1959. There was great leap forward at the time. You never hear anything about that from W.B. Du Bois. In those times when he was there for about 2 or 3 months, he gave all sorts of talks about imperialism, quite emphatically attacking the United States and its racist policies. It was the red carpet was thrown out for him. This was the time when he recovered his passport and so could travel. Anyway, that's just a reference to the photograph. Okay, let's see. So last time I tried to talk about what? I tried to talk about sociology. I'm a sociologist that loves sociology. My friends and enemies all think, poor boy, the guy who loves sociology. The last one on earth. And I was trying to think about what it means to actually have a canon and how one can reconstruct the canon. The canon is always something that changes over time. I was interested in developing an understanding of the conversation that W.B. Du Bois would have with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. How, and my view, it would actually invigorate, enrich, enliven Du Bois and definitively change sociology. I tried to indicate that in the talk. And I was glad to see lots of people couldn't really connect with what I was saying and were refusing the very idea of the canon. And perhaps some of those people having turned up today, they were so disgusted with what I said. What's going on here? Ooh, look what's happening. That's going to be interesting. Hello. All right, I'm going to give you an overview. Fortunately, I've got a printed version. So my first statement I wanted to make was to say I walk on two legs. I'm also not just a sociologist, I'm also a Marxist, and they're related to one another. But today I'm going to talk specifically about the Marxist tradition. But first, I want to say about Black Marxism. You may wonder why it is that an old white guy is talking for the United States of America. He's talking about Black Marxism. And the very notion of Black Marxism may be problematic. I'm prepared to discuss that. By Black Marxism, I'm going to understand a Marxism that takes the standpoint of the racially oppressed. And included in those Black Marxists, I'm going to talk about today, Frantz Fanon and Bois. One could talk about C.L.R. James, Stuart Hall, Oliver Cromwell Cox, and many others. Walter Rodney is another one. Many of them actually do come from the Caribbean. It is an interesting question of whether one can be white and a Black Marxist. It's a really interesting question. Whether there is something about the experience of the racially oppressed that is inaccessible to somebody whose color is white. If I'm lucky, I will return to that question at the end. But for now, I'm going to suspend that question and just go, and I'm going to be focused on the comparison of Fanon and Du Bois. Now, why Fanon and Du Bois? First of all, I am of one, very much at odds with Cedric Robinson, who we talked about in the second seminar last week. I don't have a frozen view of Marxism. I don't have an originalist view of Marxism that is one that is reduced to a particular vision of Marx, nor do I see that Marxism is reduced to Marxist-Leninism. Marxism for me is a tradition, an unfolding tradition. Marxism looks differently in different places at different times, and in different places at different times there are different anomalies and contradictions that emerge from the historical context of social transformation. So I think of, as I would say, a Marxist tradition. Now, why Fanon and Du Bois in particular, amongst the many Black Marxists that I could talk about? Well, I'm particularly familiar with these two, but I have another reason apart from that, is that they speak about similar sets of issues, a sort of post-colonial context, if we're talking about the period of Reconstruction in the United States, a post-colonial Africa, but they're doing that a century apart. The one is talking about a period of Reconstruction in the middle of the 19th century, and the other is of the middle of the 20th century. So they're very different places, different types of struggles. So if there is something called Black Marxism, and they're both included, then by comparing the two, we might get a sense of what Black Marxism might be. I'm going to argue that both Fanon and Du Bois develop what at first approximation we can call an epistemological break, a word from the 1960s, or that is to say, there's a break in both of them between a phenomenological racism, a concern with the experience of race in their early writings, and their move to what I'm going to call that Black Marxism, a political economy of racism. Yeah. So what that means, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare souls of black folk on the one side with black skin, white masks, the first Fanon, the first Fanon book. That is the phenomenology of racism. I'm going to compare those two, and then I'm going to say they both make a jump. The one to black reconstruction in America, the other to the wretched of the earth, and then compare those two. So you see, I've got a pretty ambitious program to do. But I will finish in an hour, within an hour. That means 55 minutes. All right. To make that comparison, it's not going to become very clear, I don't think. But I'm just telling you here, I'm going to use the ideas of Antonio Gramsci's methodology from the prison notebooks, where he talks about the relations of forces, how one understands the realm of politics, which is the focus, in my view, of both Black Reconstruction and the wretched of the earth, where Gramsci talks about the realm of politics as being caught between two constraints. On the one hand, an economic constraint, an analysis of the political economy, the economy itself, and on the other hand, the military. It's caught between these two, and that is what is actually informing my comparison. But my effort here today will be just to make a comparison. And if you want to talk about Gramsci, only two delights. The other concept from Gramsci that is running around in my head and in these comparisons is the distinction between the war of position and war of movement, and of course the notion of civil society. But I can't do everything, so I'm not really going to refer to that, but we can just talk about that. Now, I will also, Du Bois, interesting enough, as Kate was saying, this guy lives forever. So obviously he's going to be changing his mind. So what is interesting is that I'm going to start out by comparing Du Bois' account in Black Reconstruction with Fanon's account in Wretched of the Earth. But then Du Bois actually outlives Fanon by 2 years, and actually goes to Africa, if you wish, back to Africa. We're going to see how Du Bois in Africa actually takes some of his ideas and rejects other ideas from Black Reconstruction in his understanding of Africa. And we'll see how different or similar that is with Fanon's understanding of Africa. And then I'm going to end by talking about the positionality of Fanon and Du Bois, but particularly Du Bois, how he's positioned as Black, middle class, and American, by American, part of an imperial order. And that triple positionality leads to all sorts of, in my view, interesting contradictions in his work. Some of which will come out today. That is what I want to do. Okay, now, oops, oh, it didn't go. Okie dokies. There we go. I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was back. Okay, magic. This is what I've just been talking about. No, sorry. There we go. Overview. All right. Next, Marxism as tradition. This is how I do it. It's my Marxist treat. I really want to drive home the point is that Marxism is not a singular body of thought. It is a tradition, expanding tradition. But it has roots. It's a tree with roots. Well, we can argue about what those roots are. We might talk about, I usually think about the early writings, the humanist writings, where it sort of establishes the critical project that is the foundation, I think, in my view, of all his work. And then there's a German ideology where he sets out the postulates of his theorization of capitalism. There is the thesis on Feuerbach, which sort of, in a sense, lays out his understanding of political link between theory and practice. Well, that's great. I'll leave one open. So there are these roots, and we could argue what the roots are, and the roots themselves change. What's going on here? Oh, let's see. Must be able to give you a
What's going on?
some loose connection somewhere.
Somewhere. Does it help if we turn off the fans?
Well, let's see what happens. I guess it's going to force me to go through this really speedily. Okay, now, there are my roots again. And on the basis of that roots, there is a tree trunk. I better keep my eye on this thing. Okay, the tree trunk are what? The 3 volumes of Capital. There we go. Then out of that, well, I'm going to put the 18th Brumaire, Civil War in France, civil class struggle in France, these sort of political writings. Now we move to German Marxism. So as history moves on beyond the writing, beyond the period of Marx and Engels themselves, of course, Engels definitely sort of lives longer than Marx and does himself get involved in German Marxism. But German Marxism is the debate, from my simplistically put, is the debate between Bernstein, Luxemburg, and Kautsky about whether capitalism is coming to a final crisis or not, and what is the character of class struggle, reform, or revolution. And it reflects the struggles and of the historical moment in the period 1890-1920 in Germany. It was the golden age of Marxism, you might say, when it was really publicly discussed, and socialism seems to be genuinely on the agenda. Then we have Russian Marxism, and I have a troika there too, Trotsky, Bukharin, and Lenin. And it was a very vital and interesting Marxism that reflects the challenges of the period, the similar sort of period, 1890 to 1920, but in a very different context, Russian context, where 90% of the population is a peasant population. And well, after the revolution, we have this Russian Marxism that turns into Soviet Marxism, which I regard to be a degenerate branch of Marxism, and basically falls off the tree. Then there is Western Marxism, that has been in many ways a response to the Soviet Marxism, and associated with such figures, and we could debate which figures, Gramsci, Lukács, Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse. These were the sort of flourishing Marxism, reflecting on the one hand, a critique of the Soviet Marxism, and on the other hand, trying to come to terms with the absence, not just of the absence of a revolution, but of fascism. And then I used to put Third World, and I will still put Third World Marxism. And my candidate for Third World Marxism was Fanon always, but obviously Third World Marxism was very much inspired by Mao too, and many others, and reflecting the problematic conditions of development in what was then called the Third World, the Global South. And we did get another branch of Marxism. And today I'm going to put something up there. It looks pretty black, but first we have to get rid of that Soviet Marxism, and then we can move on to Black Marxism. All right. All I want to do with this tree is to suggest Marxism is an emerging, evolving tradition, and we don't have to relegate it or reduce it to one branch or another. Okay. All right. Good. Okay, that's Marxism. Well, something came back. Okay. Okay.
I know they have a sign here that says don't touch anything.
So I'm going to talk now about this so-called epistemological break. I'm going to move to the Bois and Fanon. I want to demonstrate to you that they're great in their writings. I've talked obviously before about the breaking writings. Great. So there's the phenomenology of racism, the political economy of racism. We find in both of these Marxists. 1868 to 1963, that Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk is the centerpiece, in my view, for a phenomenology of racism. That is to say, it's an account of the experience of racism. And for Du Bois, it adds up to a sociology of the veil, which the essays in the Souls of Black Folk include essays about the experience of education for African Americans. It's life within the African American community that is, in a sense, remote from the understanding of whites. It is the experience in terms to the sociological community of African Americans. In that essay, in that book, there are essays on the characters of segregation, the character of the sharecropping economy. There's an essay, very famous essay, by Du Bois on the death of the firstborn. So it's all about the experience of racism, which he is able to represent in a very powerful way. But it is a sociology. You can see the sociology of the community within the veil. I brought the veil for you. All right. Then we make a big jump, and we've talked about books and works in between, but I'm making the big jump to Black Reconstruction in America in 1935, written in 1935, which is an account of the origins of the US Civil War, is an account of the progress of the Civil War, the progression of the Civil War, the outcome of the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction that follows the Civil War, and follows the Declaration of Emancipation of 1863 and the constitutional amendments, 13, 14, and 15, that give citizenship and slavery, give citizenship to African Americans and protect their right to vote. It is a story then of Reconstruction. This is the bulk of this very thick book. And at the end, of course, last chapter in particular, the last two chapters, or maybe three chapters, about how Reconstruction breaks down, which we will talk about today. And what I'm going to suggest to you that Du Bois actually, though African Americans, and this is essential to his argument, play a very crucial role in actually ending the Civil War in favor of the Northern armies, because of the defection we talked about before, defection from the plantations, and they play a role in obviously in the period of Reconstruction, the development, the slow development of an interracial democracy. Nonetheless, Du Bois really does focus, I'm going to argue, on the struggles within the white group rather than within the African American society. He's interested in the particular arrangement. He's interested in, because what happens, of course, is that the Reconstruction period, with all its potentialities, turns out to a splendid failure. And we have what he calls the back to slavery, the rise of Jim Crow. And he's always trying to figure out what changes in the relationships among different white groups, North and South, working class and capitalist class, trying to understand the conditions under which there may be a reversion possibly to that interracial democracy. Anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. But anyway, he's talking about the struggles on the white side of the color line. Now let me turn to Fanon. And of course, Fanon's life is encapsulated within Du Bois's life. As we all know, Fanon died at leukemia in 61. So it's interesting, in 1961, the Bois goes on exile to Ghana, where at the same time, Fanon is going to the United States to see if there'll be any medical care that he can receive for his leukemia. Anyway, Black Skin, White Masks, in many ways, as I was suggesting in a few minutes, is again a phenomenology of racism, the experience of racism, its analysis of racism, very powerful one that has influenced so many. And I will talk about that in a minute. But where Du Bois is interested in sociology as the foundation for the experience of racism, Fanon is interested in the psychology. And he, in 1961, pens The Wretched of the Earth. He dies, and he is going to be talking about the struggles on the dark side of the color line. He is interested in the future of Africa and wants to see which class forces are going to prevail and with what consequences for the future of Africa. And as we know, he has two roads into the future: a national liberation struggle leading to socialism, and a national bourgeois road leading to basically the reproduction of the existing colonial class structure, of which he is very critical, but in fact anticipates that as the most likely eventuality in post-colonial Africa. And of course, history weighs in on his side. That is my summary of where I'm going to go. All right. Next. I want to talk a little bit about, since I haven't referred to writings, actually read anything, so I think about time I did it. Right. From the Souls of Black Folk. This is the most famous, that's the most famous passage from his account of double consciousness. Okie dokie, here we go. Oops. Right. The Negro, folks, Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, which only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. These African Americans see themselves through the eyes of the dominant whites. It is a peculiar sensation of double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. I think that's spiritual. This is a new form of encryption. So the last sentence, the history of the American Negro is the history of his strife between his two warring ideals, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. And this idea runs through the essays of the Souls of Black Folk. The double consciousness, how life within the veil is at once and has its own integrity. You're doing okay. Let's go.
Oh, I was worrying about the fans.
You worried about the fan? Boy, my PowerPoint is disappearing. You're supposed to be supporting me, not the bloody fan. Okay, the point is that this idea of double consciousness, reflects, on the one hand, the power of racism as it sort of infiltrates, shapes the life within the veil. Those are what the essays are about. I think that Fanon has probably the best rendition of what the meaning of double consciousness. Du Bois doesn't really develop this idea. Some people claim that he does in thecenter, but it has become a sort of central theme, and everybody associates double consciousness with Du Bois, but he doesn't really develop it. But Fanon, and now I'm going to just tell you a bit about Fanon. His this experience. Now, Fanon, as you probably know, is originally Martinican, and he goes to France, where he becomes a doctor in Lyon, psychoanalyst, and then leaves France for Algeria, where he had a psychiatric institution, and then he realizes that even the most progressive psychiatric theorization and practice will not really overthrow colonialism, and he joins the FLN, the National Liberation Struggle. And it is at that point that he begins to think in more Marxist terms. But let me just say something about Fanon. This is my rendition of Fanon, and I obviously would love you all to read Black-Skinned White Masks. So here it is. Fanon described the experience of Martinican immigrants to France, expecting to be embraced, the Martinican immigrants, expected to be embraced as French, because that's how they saw themselves in Martinique. They are despised, however, as black when in France. Black immigrants strive to become French by merging their Martinican self and their French self into a truer self. And I'm using here the Du Boisian vocabulary. But at every attempt, they become the object of contempt and pity. In demonstrating their facility in language and seeking sexual partners of the opposite race, in short, in trying to become white, in measuring themselves against the tape of an alien hostile world, they only cement their exclusion, eliciting derision and hatred from those that dominate them. In the very attempt to emulate whiteness, they become the subject, object, division, and hatred. Martinicans deceive themselves into thinking that this is Fanon talking now, Martinicans deceive themselves into, I can't do it. Here's the thing is that today, we're so totally reliant on the PowerPoint. Well, I'll let you finish. I can read to you. All right, Martinicans deceive themselves into thinking that they can prove themselves equal to the French, yet striving for acceptance as fellow humans proves futile. They are simply not recognized as human. The lucidity with which Fanon describes its double consciousness, seeing oneself through the eyes of the other, is its own version of second sight. Fanon is able to stand aside and understand what it is that his fellow Martinicans, middle-class Martinicans, and what ways in which they are deluding themselves. He saw what his fellow Martinicans didn't. He even ridiculed their pretension, as the title of his book suggests, Black-Skinned White Masks. Yeah. And let me just, one more paragraph here. I'll get the PowerPoint to work. At the heart of Fanon's analog of double consciousness lies symbolic violence. And I quote Fanon, what is often called the black soul is a white man's artifact. Elsewhere, willy-nilly, the Negro has to wear the livery that the white man has sewed for him. Every path of escape, this is not me, is a response to and thereby deepens what Fanon calls the epistemologization of inferiority. That inferiority is brand scheme. That is Oh, there we go. All right. That is Fanon on double consciousness. And I think if we had more time and we could read Black Skin, White Mask, I think he captures the idea in some ways in a more profound way than Du Bois, who really drops the idea of double consciousness. But for the purposes of this talk, that's not important. What is important is that we now move on to the political economy of racism. First, I'm going to talk about Fanon and then Du Bois. All right, here we go. This is my summary of the wretched review. Colonizers and colonized. Colonial state. Oh, good. And settler France. This is Algeria. He develops a quite general theory, but it really is a reflection of the conditions of power in Algeria. Conditions in South Africa, Central Africa are indeed there. Colonizers, colonial states and settler farmers. But he doesn't have a lot to say either about the colonial states and settler farmers. He is more interested in understanding the colonized and the people who will then be liberated. He wants to understand the direction in which the colony will go, the post-colony will go. So he has a class analysis. On the one hand, he talks about the rise of a national bourgeoisie, a black national bourgeoisie, along with a labor aristocracy. Both of these classes, embryonic in the colonial period, taking on a momentum of their own in the post-colonial period, both of these classes, Fanon claims, are concerned with the reproduction of the class order of colonialism. That what is happening is the color of classes changes, but the relationship between classes does not. The labor aristocracy, he argues, is actually one of the most secure of the classes compared with the peasantry, and has an interest in maintaining its aristocratic position. And he has all sorts of nasty things to say about the labor aristocracy and its unwillingness to actually participate in a more radical project. The national bourgeoisie essentially want to replace the whites who had been governing the colony. This is the urban bloc. But then we have, and this is the sort of Maoist strain, more than strain, in Fanon. He sees the peasantry as the class that has nothing to lose, a volcanic peasantry that is indeed has transformative imaginations and very much in opposition to the more conservative traditional leaders who have been the screen through which the colonizers were actually controlling the peasantry. The peasantry becomes volcanic because it is in danger of losing its very meaning of existence, that is access to land. That is what, in Fanon's view, makes them so volatile. But they, by themselves, do not have a project. They need who? Radical intellectuals, what we might call organic intellectuals, if we were using the Gramscian phrase. And it is these radical intellectuals who have a radical project, a socialist project, that are actually expelled from the cities where the national bourgeois road dominates. They move and into the rural areas, join the peasantry, and it is that very intimate connection of the volcanic eruption, the volcanic disposition of the peasantry and the guiding lens of the intellectuals that turns them into the national liberation struggle. Now the question is the national bourgeois road going to win or the national liberation struggle? And so he does a fascinating, in my view, fascinating account of the class alliances that are possible. And we have to bring in the lumpen proletariat, those who have been expelled from the rural areas into the urban areas where they are semi-employed, the informal sector, as we might call it, together with the unemployed. Where will the lumpen proletariat find its interests? They are easily, as Fanon says, they are easily persuaded by either side. They do indeed have a inclination, disposition to become volcanic, like the peasantry, but they also are easily bribed to follow the national bourgeoisie. So that is one group of which these two projects struggle over. The other are traditional leaders. Which way will they go? And so there is a struggle here. You might say it's a struggle for hegemony within, among the colonized, as to which road the post-colony will take. And, well, much of Africa has taken the natural bourgeois road. And there are many problems, particularly looking at this from the standpoint of South Africa. But here I just want to underline the sort of Marxian analysis. In this case, the analysis of the class forces at work within and among the colonized. Yeah. And Fanon does have an international perspective to this. He argues that the sort of conventional Marxist way that Western capital is actually dependent upon Africa for markets and for raw materials, natural resources. And so he argues that the national liberation struggle can hold the West accountable, whereas the national bourgeoisie are an appendage of Western capital. Then it is possible, he argues, for the national liberation struggle to hold Western capital accountable and to extract some reparations. And in this regard, he is indeed very optimistic. All right, that's it. Well, as I say, that if you want to put the Gramsci perspective in, I will do it just here. That it's a war of movement against the colonial state and a war of position, a struggle for hegemony within, amongst the colonized in their struggles for a future. And what is interesting about this, whereas Gramsci tended to say that war of position follows war of movement, or war of movement follows war of position, they coincide in the colonial context. There's no evidence that Fanon read Gramsci. All right, now I'm going to talk about Du Bois. Now, this is more complicated. All right. Hang on. Don't fall asleep just because, please. Now, let's start. This is the Civil War, 1861-65, and we talked about this before. Here Du Bois has a class analysis of slavery, and whether we call it a degenerate form of capitalism or a distinct mode of production is not crucial for the argument here. What we see here is the planter class, white planter class, organizes white as overseers and patrols over the enslaved in the plantations. And alongside the plantations, there are white merchants, white professionals, and many poor whites. There are free blacks in the north, but even in the south, not many. There are fugitives from the plantations, and there are few revolts relative to the multiplicity of revolts that take place in the Caribbean and in other Latin American countries. There are few revolts, mainly because there is an exit option. The fugitive slave is able to exit, well, not easily, but it is possible, and that sort of puts a lid on the possibility of revolts. There are, but not so many. Yeah. So the Marxian account here is of the expansionism of slavery. Under the pressure of demand for more and more cotton, the slave mode of production tries to expand. The planters try to expand. They are self-indulgent, traditional, consumption-oriented. They are not the prototype capitalist who is continually innovating, though that is now disputed in historiography, but that's not my concern. I'm trying to give you a sense of the Marxian type analysis that Du Bois offers here. The expansionism is what actually gives rise to the Civil War, because the North is prepared to have slavery within the South, within the limits of the South, but is not prepared to accept the expansion of slavery. And so the war. Southern armies, northern armies. And it looks as though the southern armies might actually win. The enthusiasm for the war from the north on the part of whites is not great, keeping the Union together. And the southern armies have the advantage of the enslaved population providing all the resources necessary to keep the army going, so that all the men can actually be participants as troops. And then we have the general strike, which we've talked about before, that as the northern armies moved around the south, so part of the enslaved population dares to leave the plantations and try to join the northern armies. In the beginning, the northern armies will not touch them. They are seen as contraband. But finally, when the northern armies have their backs to the wall, they begin to recruit the African American, formerly enslaved population. And this, according to Du Bois, becomes pivotal to the success of the northern armies. Half a million of the enslaved, 4 million enslaved, leave the plantations. A very risky thing for them to do, since they may not be recruited and accepted by the northern armies, and they may be caught by the patrols of the southern armies. All right, that's the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, we have had in 1863 the Emancipation Declaration, emancipation of the slaves, and that was in part a reflection of the increasing dependency of the northern armies on the formerly enslaved population. And after the end of the Civil War, 1865, we get a period of Reconstruction. Du Bois calls it a splendid failure, but he is transforming our understanding of this period, this like a post-colonial period. He sees within it the possibility of an interracial democracy. Let me give you a picture of this. The central institution of the Reconstruction period is what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is there to actually nurture the emancipation of African Americans by actually giving them access to courts, to education, and to the legislature, to participation in politics, to giving them the vote. The Freedmen's Bureau has at its disposal a bank, which turns out to be a rather problematic bank. And it has also at its disposal the military, because of course the South is not taking this lying down. Indeed, on the one hand, there is this government from the North. At the same time, the local state continues to exist. And white labor and the planters are able to impress themselves, pursue their interests in the local state. What we have essentially is a situation of dual power. And the landless, black labor, they are in a sense, their interests are pursued and protected and advanced by the Freedmen's Bureau insofar as it is possible to do so. Now, on the next slide, I'll show how difficult it is. But one of the crucial elements that we all know, and Du Bois emphasizes, is precisely that the one crucial element of some sort of interracial democracy would be what? Distribution of land. But there is no distribution of land. The Freedmen's Bureau tries to accumulate resources to do so, but in the end fails to do so, which of course is a major reason why Reconstruction fails. At the same time, there is northern capital coming into the South, trying to exploit the situation. Yeah. So that is my picture of the sort of emergent for 11 years of democracy, but it is just so under the most difficult circumstances. White labor and planters are organizing such white groups that terrorize any blacks that are show any sign of success, but perhaps even those who accumulate some land, those who participate in politics. They do participate, but there is a sort of underground, or sometimes very much overground war, struggle against the ideals of Reconstruction. And so, back towards slavery, that's after the end of Reconstruction in 1876. And why does it end? The North, capitalists in the North, have very famous chapter in this book. Counter-revolution of capital. It is the counter-revolution of capital. It's not the white working class. It's the counter-revolution of capital in the North, the financial industrial class that decides that they are now prepared to collaborate with the erstwhile planter class, having demolished the project of that planter class, the expansionist project. They are now prepared to make compromises, collaborate with the planter class. This goes along with political ramifications in the Supreme Court, which effectively abolishes the 14th and 15th Amendments, that effectively make it very difficult to effectively give rights back to the states. And in giving rights back to the states, they are actually giving power to the planter class, voter suppression, and basically giving an open hand to the violence against African Americans. We have this segregated labor market. We have the planter class, we have the white workers, and we have black workers. Now, the black workers are, in a sense, still subjugated, so it's not a really good picture. The black workers are subjugated to the planter class on the basis of a sharecropping economy, which actually is a new form of repressive agriculture that bears close resemblance, Du Bois says, to slavery. Black sharecroppers are just not able to leave their servitude to the planter class, now often an absentee landowning class. The white workers have the wages of whiteness that I talked about before. The psychological and public wage. That is, white workers have access, privileged access to courts, hospitals, schools, and public venues denied to black workers. The wages of whiteness. They also have a feeling that they are superior. That is the psychological moment of the wage, superior to black workers. And that they can possibly become themselves part of the planter class. The southern states engage in voter suppression, convict labor, all of which reduces black workers to a oppressed class with limited rights. And when, as I said before, when they show initiative, when they accumulate, when they participate in politics, they are too often subject to mob violence and the likes of Cain. All right, gosh, we got there. Conclusion. That's amazing. Okay, those are my two stories. Now I want to, just to get a sense of what I make of all this. Well, I just want to say, parenthetically, really, that this comparison that I've been trying to make does follow a Gramscian methodology, looking at politics set with limited by these, like on one hand, the balance of class forces in the economy, and military forces on the other. And there is an interesting sort of war of position, war of movement in both of these analyses. In the case of Black Reconstruction, you might see the Civil War itself as a war of movement, but as fascinatingly, as the formerly enslaved participate in the war and begin actually to take over the plantations and grow crops for the troops. There is a sort of emergent civil society there. And what, of course, is happening in the Reconstruction is precisely that, a new civil society, a warrior position that, of course, is aborted after all this. All right. Struggles within. Well, as I try to suggest to you, Du Bois is first and foremost concerned to look at the balance of forces among the white population in the North and in the South. That is where he puts the emphasis in his analysis. It is true that the formerly enslaved become this pivotal force, but there's no examination of the class differences that may be emerging within African American population. And that is a signal characteristic of Du Bois's more broader analysis. That he tries to constitute African Americans as a potentially united force. He gets disappointed time and again and begins to recognize the development of classes within the African American population in the middle of the 20th century. But at least in Black Reconstruction, that sort of analysis does not appear. Whereas the opposite is the case for Fanon, who is interested in not why post-colonialism was a disaster. He's looking at the trajectories, the possible futures of the post-colony, and wants to see how the class forces are lining up and giving support to different projects. Of course, they're writing at a different time. Du Bois is writing in 1935 about something that happened a century ago, whereas Fanon is writing in 1961 when independence movements have not finally determined the direction in which they were going. Du Bois, interesting enough, as I said before, he writes at least 3 books on the history of Africa. And this becomes a very important part of his Pan-Africanist project. He never goes to Africa after 1923 when he visits Liberia. And he finally makes it back to Africa in 1961 at the invitation of Nkrumah. And he dies 2 years later in Ghana. But if you look at Du Bois's writings on post-colonial Africa, they are very much from the outside. He doesn't undertake the sort of analysis that Fanon does, a sort of class analysis from within. Well, he doesn't have the material to do that. And he's removed, but also what is interesting, he sees Africa as important in its own rights and suggests it take an independent route at some point. He says neither the socialist, neither the Chinese road nor the Western capitalist road. He might imagine that he has a vision of socialism not that different from Fanon in his national liberation struggle. But he doesn't examine the struggles within Africa after independence. He doesn't have access to that. And as often is the case when Du Bois writes about other countries, his vision of those other countries is often shaped by his position in the United States and his own project for the rest of the world, which is to undermine US imperialism. Okay. I guess I'm nearing the end here. Yeah, so one of the most interesting things about Du Bois seems to me, if we're going to try and make sense of his work as a whole, is to recognize that his positionality involves position vis-a-vis his race, his class, and his nationality. When he writes about the double consciousness, that is a sort of simplification of his own life. Du Bois' understanding of his blackness leads him on some occasions to join other blacks in sometimes a national and even an international struggle, but at other times leads him particularly in the beginning, to identify himself as an upper class black who should be recognized by whites. There's a sort of ambiguity about his notion of his own understanding of race. And class, similarly, his class position. Sometimes he identifies as, when he talks about the talented tenth, he identifies the talented tenth with the African American population as a whole, if not the darker races of the globe as a whole. And at other times, he recognizes that there are emergent class divisions within the African American population, that you cannot sort of collapse the interests of the dominant in subordinate classes with what that. And then he moves from the talented tenth to the guiding hundredth. He's very much disillusioned by the development, particularly in the 1950s, of a class of bourgeois class. And then there is he's an American, his nationality. But as an American, he's part of he's a citizen, black citizen in an imperial country. And that leads him sometimes to have somewhat condescending views towards African Americans and even other races around the world. But it also leads him to see the possibilities of struggles galvanized by anti-imperialism, anti-US. He becomes very much, that's one of the reasons why he's, in a sense, it's a political move for him to embrace the Soviet Union and embrace China. It is a move against imperial US, to which he has become increasingly hostile. Well, the feeling was mutual, as I described, I think, in one of my lectures, how he was indicted as an undeclared foreign agent of a foreign principal, and how his participation in the peace movement made him an enemy of the US state and eventually drove him out of the country. So I think this idea of double consciousness could be elaborated more profoundly, perhaps, and more broadly, if we sort of re-examine Du Bois's life. And I put gender in brackets. Of course, there's been a lot of commentary about Du Bois's analysis. He writes 3 or 4 important essays. One very important essay in Dark Water called The Damnation of Women, which has a sort of socialist feminist project at the end. But yeah, he's been criticized both in terms of how he writes about gender. He emphasizes more the tension for women between being a homemaker and being a participant in the public sphere as a worker. But that tension has to be transcended. He does not have a lot to say about black masculinity. And of course, he himself, his own black masculinity, as it has been pointed out on many occasions, particularly after the second volume of Levi Lewis's biography, he has a very Victorian relationship to his wife and has quite a few affairs on the side. Yes. Anyway, so that's the positionality story. And finally, Black Marxism. So I come back to this question. So what I'm trying to show that both of these, most Marxists move from a phenomenology of racism to a political economy of racism. And the question then is, see, if I call that an epistemological break, then the idea is that the Marxism leaves behind the phenomenology. But it doesn't. Neither Fanon nor Du Bois really leave behind the phenomenology of racism. And I think that's the crucial thing. Is that phenomenon, that experience of racism, so central even as a foundation of the political economy, can that be grasped by somebody who has not experienced racial subjugation? That's the question, it seems to me. Is there something about the phenomenology of racism that prevents the idea of whites being black Marxists? Can we say that Jack Simons and Ray Simons are black Marxists? Can we say that Harold Wolpe is a black Marxist? That's just two. I'll leave that in your hands. And finally, yes, we could extend this comparison to C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James is like I would say, such an archetype. He passed through so many different phases, backwards and forwards in different countries. But still, he writes the Black Jacobins, which we should all be reading if we haven't read before. And the Black Jacobins is the obvious comparison to Wretched of the Earth and Black Reconstruction. And I think an argument can be made that the early life of C.L.R. James in Trinidad, and even in England, is one that's focused more on the phenomenology of racism than the sort of analysis he applies to the Black Jacobins. Yes. And of course, as you know, C.L.R. James pretty very much bound up with a sort of global analysis, but also phenomenology of racism. It's almost like a multiple, and that is relatively late on in his life. Anyway, that's a street in store for you, C.L.R. James. And on that note, I'll end. Oops, I think we should do that. Okay.
Can you turn the lights on inside?
So,
I know, but I think we should try to put the slide here. Instead of lighting it down, can you put more lights on? Wonderful, okay.
wow.
Excellent, all right. Opening up for questions, comments. Morning, sorry, yes. What? All right.
Can I go?
That
Thanks, Bob, for another presentation. I know you've asked us to do this. I'm not sure if you're wanting us to do the work for you, but I'm sure you have a definition yourself. So, what is Black Marxism? Are these Black Marxists, or are these Marxist analyses developed by Black and other individuals, and those individuals that from an anti-colonial, anti-imperial perspective? In so doing, then including not just C.L.R. James, but Fidel Castro, so Joe Sloper, but also key eminent African Marxists like Simone Michel, Julius Nyerere, etc. And if both those are in the answer to the question, as well as I'm sure there are other answers that usually answers. Then I think perhaps there's a spectre once your Marxist team. I think that spectre is communism. Because I've never ever seen, and I've never been taught that Marxism is just a tool of analysis, but also an ideological orientation, a political ideological orientation, socio-economic change. So thus, if we include in our definition of Black Marxism, or Black Marxism, those particular individuals, which I think one would, the political strategies feature at the forefront of their activism. They were not just thinkers, they were also doers and implementers. And much of what is their Marxism or Marxism and their political orientations were pretty much cut and paste Marxist political strategy, Marxist Leninism purpose. The use of the state, so what is what Black Marxism, and your desire to want to remove Soviet, what you term Soviet Marxism, from the field of Marxism, when in fact, I think that, particularly in the 20th century, so what you call Soviet or Russian Marxism is in fact quite a substantial part of the trunk upon which Black Marxism is based. There are attempts to define a democratic Marxist tradition, and number one, that both consciously and unconsciously highlights that there's an undemocratic aspect of Marxism. And I think in the discussion about what democratic Marxism is, the response to what it is, or to what Marxism actually is that there were these bad guys. There were these bad guys. And if you can just remove these bad guys from the canon, then we have the real Marxism. But I think that's doing the political strategy and its application throughout the 20th century, particularly in the colonial and post-colonial world, a service.
I mean, of course, that was the provocation. What is Black Marxism? So that's another question. You know, I am. I thought I posed the question. Yeah. So let me see what else people.
All right. So,
I think if you want to be a Black Marxist, you can. I don't think in a very subjective sense, but I mean it more in the sense that you're not just a white American play. You're a whole complexity person. You know, you're British, you're American. You might even want to claim a certain kind of background as well. And I think that we're more complex than this notion of double consciousness. I think you're quite right to kind of make the link that you have done between the earlier Bois and Fanon. I wonder whether Du Bois was always consistent, as you suggest. I think some people do recognize that. And I think there was an argument for it. But it seems to me that we need to understand the problem and to understand the answer to your question. You've got to bring Gramsci back into the story. I mean, his notion of dual consciousness is not the same thing, because even though there are certain similarities in terms of the concepts to grapple with, his dual consciousness is much more dialectical. It brings in different things, and there's a certain kind of resolution to the contradiction in terms of definition and stuff. I'm introducing this partly because of another problem. It was implicit in what you're saying. And I think that's about internationalism. You know, we talk about C.L.R. James in the way in which you put it with regards to Black. I think you've been a little bit unfair on it, because it's also well, that's maybe that's not unfair. I think you could take it further in terms of thinking about Haiti and the French Revolution. And I think that the panel that you present is a somewhat limited one, and one could bring into the much more global, international picture. So I'm just a bit worried here that the way in which you represent these writers is a little bit too narrow, and that if you were to think it in much more global terms, and in terms which are much more Gramsci about, you know, apply Gramsci, if you like, to Du Bois, even Fanon, and to yourself, then you reach different conclusions.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a particular way of approaching the question of Black Marxism. That is to say, whether Marxism is still between ancient revolution where Marxism rested on a specific experience of being racially oppressed. And I'm not giving you the definitive answer. That is how I was approaching it. And so I think that's I don't know what the answer to that. I really don't. Whether the experience of being black is so deep and different that it's impossible to actually build a Marxism experience. As the yes, the Marxism mechanism, yes, of course I dropped off. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The Marxism is absolutely crucial to so many of these projects of so many people we might call Black Marxism. But let's Du Bois. No, I don't think Du Bois was ever a Marxist-Leninist. I don't think that Fanon was ever a Marxist-Leninist. Walter Rogers, difficult. C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James. There may be moments, but yeah, I don't think that they actually, I think there's an interesting question I was thought about this. Whether Black Marxism in some way is itself antithetical to Marxism. Question for me, whether it is. Interesting question. I guess I'm presuming, yeah, I think I am presuming that there is a willingness to go on that thing. So that might, and so the Joe Slogans and even Jack Simons, who were quite in some ways Marxist-Leninists in their practice. And that's, of course, that's another distinction. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I'm going to South Africa to find a few answers. Yeah, I'm very curious what other people think. So, anyway, that's the way I looked at it. Okay, right, Gramsci, more Gramsci. I love that more Gramsci. And I'd love to be much more international about the whole thing. And I should be. I was only given an hour. If you give me 5, I can do it. And you're absolutely right about C.L.R. James. You can't think about C.L.R. James without thinking internationally. He is one of the greatest of the internationalists, not just economically, but politically. Black Academics is just the most extraordinary book. And so for that matter, it's beyond the boundary. And I apologize for doing injustice in 30 seconds to C.L.R. James. You're absolutely right. Du Bois is a more complicated picture, actually. Because he's had more limited view internationally, I think, suggested. And the limitations of it. Frantz Fanon, I think, was also somewhat limited. There was also some. The C.L.R. James sort of stands at the shoulders of government. But yes, we have to look at that broader perspective. And Gramsci, it's the dual consciousness in Gramsci science, is the idea that there is a tension between the lived experience, between the common sense and the good sense. The common sense, according to Gramsci, is actually the sort of lived experiences that people have. And the good sense is the idea that one can connect that common sense to a bigger picture of how the world could be. And so he says that only the working class, the industrial working class, can actually move beyond the common sense that is saturated with folk theories and with ideologies from above. Only the working class can actually grasp the common sense with the help of organic intelligence. That, of course, is somewhat similar to an argument. But Gramsci would say that the peasants are because they cannot grasp the picture. But yes, that dual consciousness is actually quite different from Du Bois's double consciousness. And I'm sure about that connection.
Right now, it's around John Root.
Yeah, there are ideological Marxists, which will say he's Marxists. There are democratic Marxists, which will say Marxists, Black Marxists. It seems that these terms, before Marxism, seem to be a response to other traditions of Marxism. that I think are lacking or I don't know. But my question then is, to what extent, when you go back to the foundation, the foundation of Marxism, and to what extent are all these questions excluded from those foundations and track? The question of race, the question of policy, even the question of gender, because other people say, no, Marx help with these questions at various stages of the evolution. So I just wanted to get a sense because there's always something else in Marx. Does it really deal with the foundation? Yeah, body of Marx. As different by Marx.
I'd like to put more thought to the question, can white be Black Marxist? And I do think it's very difficult for white people to be able to be conscious of experience of Black people. I mean, just thinking about my own personal experience, the challenging of racism feels like I'm constantly going through like a 12-step AA program, right? Where we live in a racist society. And there's all sorts of things that shape the way that we interact with it. And I think it's a real process of learning and humility. But then the question becomes, can white people have an analysis of racism that in some way is part of the Black Marxist tradition, whether they're Black Marxists or not? And I think I mean, we all live in a racist society. And I wonder to what extent, whether it's the study of whiteness and white supremacy, have been able to kind of open new spaces of thinking also in that regard. I was thinking about the kind of comparison between W.E.B. Du Bois and Fanon, and the context in which they were writing, and to what extent that also shaped. So, if in the context of Black Reconstruction, you didn't have African Americans in power. Fanon is writing in a period where Africans are taking over the state. And so I wonder if that then also shapes the kinds of questions that are being asked, particularly around the sort of class dynamics. And there again, then thinking about the post-colonial period, and let's say where do racial minorities, where do white people fit into these kinds of movements that are emerging? I think that's also sort of an interesting question. Because understanding the class dynamics of the formerly colonized becomes important in terms of understanding the class dynamics of the post-colonial society in which everyone is. So anyway, what are the things? Fish and then
I just want to speak to Black Marxism. I mean, if you just use this exacting criteria or standard of a phenomenological experience of racism to be a Black Marxist, Marxist committed to fighting racism and so on, then that also excludes the tree of the roots of Marxism. Some people can go there. They can argue that, well, Marx was white, Engels was white, they don't have an existential and ontological experience of racism, therefore that's out. So the whole tree of Marxism collapses. I mean, if you just hang it on that. But I also think that, I also think that we also got to understand the genesis of where this comes from. This idea of Black Marxism. So that takes us back to Cedric Robinson. And maybe you can help us, but I really think he's speaking in a U.S. context. He has a political and intellectual project, and he's taking out some kind of space for something. And again, Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, and then, things travel. So, Black Marxism suddenly travels to South Africa, and then intersectionality suddenly travels to South Africa, as though we don't have conception of Marxism, of racial oppression, as though we don't have a conception of triple oppression, and so on and so on. So I'm just saying there's something contextual about this concept. And I think, to elevate it suddenly, I'm not sure about it. I mean, the last point I'll make is that I think if you look at the entire tree of Marxism, there is an anti-racism in the roots. So there is a decolonial Marxism. There's something in third world Marxism, there's something in Latin American Marxism, etc., etc. So what happens then to anti-racism if we just privileging sort of Black Marxism as the kind of place where you can only be anti-racist?
Okay, Ben?
It's more a question for Michael and for this maybe. I was wondering actually, does the term predate federalism? Are there other people earlier that called themselves Black Marxists? And for Cedric Robinson, it's kind of, if he's saying that there is such a thing as Black Marxists, he's saying they're not really Marxists. And he's kind of trying to pull them out of Marxism in a way. And yet you're taking these thinkers and saying, actually, they move to this political economy of race, and therefore, they are somehow Marxists, to bring them back to Marxism. But I think, I asked a question in one of last week's lectures, and I have the same question, which is like, we can say this Black Marxism because they have a political economy analysis of race, but lots of non-Black Marxists could make a political economy analysis of race. The question for me becomes, is there something distinctive about the way they understand the role of race in capitalism, or the relationship of race in capitalism? And I don't have an answer or an argument there, but I think that it's something different to make a political economy of race than to say race is somehow integral to the process of capitalism. So I guess that's my question to you. Would you say that there's something beyond just using political economy to analyze race about the way they analyze the role of race in capitalism? If there is, then I think there's something to Black Marxism. Otherwise, you're just saying they're actually normal Marxists who are black and things.
And what Marx always said, because identities, questions, problems, contradictions can emerge as Marxism develops. The question is whether there is continued to be a reference back to those foundations. Fish has already given space for that to happen, but if we read Kevin Anderson, there is a third Marx. And the third Marx is one that is very concerned about nationalism and race. Du Bois borrowed, actually, many of the ideas, I believe, of Marx's analysis of the Civil War in the United States. Marx was always openly hostile to slavery. And I even quoted last time a quote from Marx about liberation of the working class, two races, one ground. So I think
I think there are intimations of the importance of this in Marx, and as Bishop saying in other Marxists and other branches. But what more Ben is asking, is there a distinctive Marxism? Could a white person have written Black Reconstruction? Or The Wretched of the Earth? Or Black Jacobins? I haven't got an answer to that. And it may be that I'm just taking an American idea and running with it, but I think it's an important idea in this world of identity politics, you know? I mean, one of the retreats from Marxism, it seems to me, is to say he's white and European. Okay, so that seems to suggest it's supporting the idea of Black Marxism. Well, let's hit that head on. Let's ask that question. I'm thinking always about how Bothbegin, because he did a Marxist analysis of South Africa, which I still see is quoted widely today. And he insists, this is where it gets interesting. He insists in a very anyway, in a wonderful three projects. And one of those, the second one said, Marxists, Marxists, theoretical Marxists, it's all about theoretical Marxists can examine the structures of the concept, how the cheap labor power is used through the articulation of modes of production. But he then says the question of consciousness is left to the past. So he's trying to have to answer your question. I mean, he's trying to have he's saying yes, that we can do Marxist analysis, but there are other agents that have to sort of specialize in the appreciation and understanding of consciousness. And of course, he's in England when he's writing this, so he's not going to be able to engage in those struggles at the time in the way that the movements in the. But yeah, so that's can you do a structural analysis? Can we call him a Black Marxist, even though he is definitively advocating the access to Black consciousness? Yes, so I am saying yes. Yes, well, there is a question, yes, that people always say. That is precisely why the comparison is interesting. Du Bois is writing in 1935, but he sees the failure of Reconstruction. It's clear. And so perhaps that is not unreasonable that he should be then thinking very much more about, well, it's not necessarily, but that leads him, I think, to sort of emphasize that the white supremacy dimension within the period of Reconstruction, how often it collapsed. Now, it's not actually, this is one of the interesting things about Reconstruction. South Carolina, it's not the South Carolina, very significant. Once you withdraw the military support for the Freedmen's Bureau, and once you're not going to redistribute that whole thing, during that period of 11 years, there are places where actually have to be done. But anyway, the point is that Fanon is writing a completely different, relationship across the whole project. It's not open, it's open, and therefore he wants to know which direction of the independence movement is going to take. It's fun.
Right. Thank you.
I want to turn the question again. Not focus on, work on the meaning of black. And firstly, the way in which we are in 1970s, 80s, and 90s is that you cannot homogenize. Not all blacks are the same. That a black capitalist may experience totally differently from a black worker, a black peasant. And the way we argue, I'm not suggesting the only way to argue that the black middle class experienced discrimination on the ground, whereas the black working class were exploited because of the way in which surplus black was. Of course, they will also experience racial oppression, racial class. So I suppose my first question is really around the problem of homogenizing. The second one is, and this might sound good, it's actually a serious problem. There is an academic article published in Monthly Review in the late 80s that argues that Marx was a black. It argues that, and the argument is based on the fact that Marx was Spanish Jew, Sephardi Jew. So he was a Sephardi Jew, and he was very dark skinned, and was known as the swag because he was so dark. I mean, I'm drawing on the art. You know how much work it does with you art. That's kind of, I mean, and I mean, I was by heard what a class. So, social things. I was supposed to argue. So, but the problem was he wasn't. But that was put forward as a scholarly article, peer reviewed before the rest of it. The third point I was to make is, the way that Steve Biko used to argue was that blackness is a political concept. And therefore, whites who identified themselves with the struggle could actually be what he considered to be black brothers. I mean, I'm just mentioning that. And then just finally, just thinking like if you ask us thinking about South Africa, response, I'm sort of drawing on tradition with unity, which was, is always had. I'm going to simplify it. It's kind of Trotsky's tradition. Continue the roots. They argue that race is not a scientific concept. There's no such thing really as race. They're human beings, but not race. So they actually unequivocally, not going down that, if you like, racialized part in their politics. I'm just really drawing away, trying to, not that I have to answer the question, but sort of looking at from complexity. Yeah. I think if insofar as that's different experiences, different the Bois said, "Who is a man? That man that doesn't must be segregated color. Seeking the form of That's right. I need to say that's what defines the black. And the question is whether there is something. I don't. We have to question this. Is there something really distinctive about the black experience that transcends all its attributes? I think it's a good question. You get an exemption, but there are other forms of oppression other than passive. I mean, that's the only sense I can make of this. Yeah. Oh, I understand the question.
Are there other questions?
Sorry.
No, I just want to make sure that there are others that I'm more about.
I'm so used to on with it, you can't anybody else to do it.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just trying to frame through the conversation. And that when we add any prefix to the idea of Marxism, when we add any word, prefix any word, what we are doing is Black Marxist. Kind of located in the same discussion that we have. Is it to say that because after following these 4 lectures, is it to say that to argue or to give a racialized form of capitalism, that argument makes, if anyone who argues that, then becomes part of this large tradition of Black Marxism? Is that one point? And if it is so, then how is it fundamentally different from the fundamental idea of Marxism, which is based on dialectic and materialism, which is the basis of the double consciousness that we were talking about? Now, so, and what has happened over this period in the Marxist tradition, that the variations that you see within Marxism, the variation or the prioritization of any of these two, whether you are more talking about dialectic, about change, and not looking at the existing condition, or you are so engrossed in the existing condition that you do not forget about the change, then bringing the change. And hence you have the different traditions within Marxism, which you have said the plurality of Marxism in various ways. Now, therefore, to call either of Black Marxism or a question even for Wish of the democratic Marxism, is it about the same plurality of Marxism, which can actually be, dealt with, great detail by only within the broad umbrella of Marxism, or you are adding a new dimension to these 2 dimensions of amity? Are you adding a newer dimension by prefixing the word? Are you adding a new dimension to the dialectic and materialism? Is there something new coming on the table? That's all.
I would say, sure.
No questions. No. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so if the phenomenology of racism, those 2 books, Soul Black Code and Last of the White Mass, is that in the simple terms, subjective experience of racism? They both experience. You say that epistemological, then into a structural position, where they now are looking at the structure. And so to me, I haven't read the instructions like that, but I think in the progression of the curve, Fanon would not consider himself a Black Marxist. Can't imagine. Structural analysis, in many ways, he's actually, I think, trying to on which has class and white mass. It's very much about his assimilation and how it's just rejected from this idea that he's going to be assimilated as a Frenchman. I think that process led into the structural analysis. I don't know if I'm comfortable with this idea that they want to put themselves. And then I started thinking, where she comes from this press background that never goes, that always analyzes the situation. If you did the second question on a structural level, So it's because it's still part of the immigration. So that would make it more complicated, in terms of where they are. So challenging myself.
I think what let me start. I'm not going to answer the question. I'm going to answer the question. But it's important. The issue is there really an epistemological break between the phenomenology of racism and structural racism? That's how I began. But now I pose the question. So, for example, in the case of Fanon, when he describes the national democracy in the post-colonial, he's importing the sorts of analysis he makes of middle-class Martinicans in France into his analysis. I think that, as I understand it, for many who want to talk about a Black Marxism, they have to refuse that epistemological break in extreme form. That there is an importation from black skin white mass into the rest of the earth. And there is an importation of souls of black folk, for example, into. Now, I haven't quite seen it in Black Reconstruction, but I think that is what the argument is. I'm only trying to sort of figure out what it means to make the argument. So that's not, yeah. And then the question is there something really new about this Black Marxism? And it revolves around the same question again of the importance of the phenomenology of racism. That should be a Black Reconstruction. I can see it much in the I can see it. Black Reconstruction. It's a very powerful analysis of the destruction of families. Something that not say is unique to enslaved African Americans. Some might be add on. You know, the same things come, I suppose, at times, to be honest. And I have to think, when I'm going to teach to boys, am I entitled to teach the boys? I want to give some rationality to the arguments that I am not entitled to teach. And something, and this is how I understand the argument, there's something about my white experience that makes the Black experience inaccessible to me. I suppose I can still teach the boys, but anyway, that's a particularity. So, it's interesting to see here. No, Einstein, that's feminism. I always have to ask myself, can I be a feminist? And I always thought, no, way. Of course, there are very few men who have made great contributions to feminism. And the one that we all think about is their transition from I don't know what's perhaps there's something wrong with me, but I think underlying this are questions about who can teach what. Now, perhaps I'm giving too much ground to the opposition, so to speak. Yes, I am. Okay, fine. All right, I still think I have to confront the question. Okay. No, I'm not the same. Any more questions?
So yeah.
Well, all right, then thank you very much. You're giving lots to go away. Every time we go to South Africa, always rethinking my whole. What is it? So, thank you very much.
sign, this is the final, the last case, I mean, it's amazing how many people that come every night, so, 4 nights, thank you. So, we've saying this might have another round.